Flat Earth theory is as old as recorded history, owing much of its early assertions to religion and early astronomy, as mankind made its first attempt to think beyond the ground at our feet. However, even after many hundreds of years of growing knowledge and observation which pointed to a globe Earth, the Flat Earth theory persisted despite the evidence. Hi, I'm R.
And I'm Jay.
And in this video, we're going to address the top 10 most common arguments in favour of the Flat Earth. Let's get right into it. Number 1. You can't observe the curvature of the Earth. Of course, if we could simply see the Earth's curvature easily with the naked eye without much difficulty, then the Flat Earth theory probably wouldn't have survived as long as it has. The reason we can't simply look out our window at the horizon and see an obvious curve, or the fact that we don't notice the curve on long drives or walks, is simply because the Earth is far too large from our perspective, with a circumference of about 40,075 kilometers. The curvature of a ball that has about 40 centimeters circumference is obvious to the human eye, as we can see the object in full quite easily. However, if we scale ourselves down to 182 nanometers, which is about the size of a 6-foot human on this scale, then we wouldn't expect to have the same perspective of the ball and its curvature. It requires a long distance to travel away from an object as large as the Earth before we can begin to see any visible curvature with the naked eye. Now, when we look at pictures of the Earth from a satellite, we are able to clearly see the curvature of the Earth. Now, flat earthers respond to this damning evidence by claiming it's all fake, but we will address that argument in the next section. However, there are a few things you can do to test the curvature of the Earth without going into space. One thing you can do is observe how increased height will increase the distance you can see. In a flat Earth model, the only reason increasing height would increase sight distance would be if you were being elevated over a visual obstruction, like a hill. We can negate this issue by going to the beach and observing water. When we do that and observe the sunset, notice that when the sun sets, it disappears from the bottom first, as that section of the sun is being blocked by the horizon line. If the Earth was flat, you would either be able to always see the sun, or the sun would get smaller and smaller in diameter until eventually it would become so small you could no longer make it out. There is absolutely no reason why the top of the sun would be perfectly visible, but the bottom half would not if the Earth was flat. Now, if the Earth was flat, the entire visual diameter of the sun would decrease evenly until it is no longer visible. To confirm that it is the horizon line and not distance that is blocking out the sun, you can go to the beach, lie down and watch the sunset, and then stand up and see the sun again, because you can now see over the horizon line due to the extra 6 feet or so of elevation that you've gained. If the sun was flat, standing up or reaching any higher ground would give you no extra distance of sight. Another simple method for testing the curvature of the Earth is an experiment conducted by Greek mathematician Eratosthenes around 200 BC, where you place 2 sticks in the ground at 2 different locations at least a mile apart. On a flat Earth, the angle of the shadows would be identical. However, on a curved Earth, the angles would be different. You can test this for yourself. Simply record the angle of the shadow at the same time at the 2 different locations, and it will be different. Using that difference, Eratosthenes was able to use Pythagoras' theorem to calculate the circumference of the Earth with a surprising amount of accuracy, and you can do it too.
Number 2. All photos from outer space are fake. As mentioned previously, the photos from outer space immediately debunk the flat Earth, so the standard response to this is to claim that the photos are faked or altered. Typically, flat earthers link to videos where allegedly NASA employees admit that the photos are fake. When you watch or read these interviews, you will typically hear the NASA employee describing how they process the images they get from the satellites, which includes adjusting the saturation so certain things can be made out in low light, or adding together multiple images taken to get a larger composite image. So, are they admitting to faking the images? If NASA had an agenda to fool the public, why would they openly discuss the process of how they put these images together? It's because there is a perfectly good reason to filter and edit images. If you look at the single non-composite images of the Earth released by NASA, you may find that the resolution isn't as impressive as the composite image taken by the Terra satellite in 2002. Even images taken in 2015 by the Discover satellite aren't as clear. This occurs because the image taken by the Terra satellite is a composite recorded over 8 days at a distance of only 443 miles above the Earth, taking individual overlapping images of the terrain below as it makes passing cycles around the Earth. Comparatively, the more modern but less clear image taken by Discover was a single capture taken at 930,000 miles from the Earth. This equates to a massive difference in information which has to be structured and organized into a single picture. You will notice that as the satellite begins a new cycle around the Earth, it leaves gaps between the previous cycle. When the image is completed, these gaps need to be removed, or we would just be left with an incomplete picture. This is achieved by filling in the space with adjacent image data, resulting in a repeating pattern at the gap locations. This is a fact commonly used to argue that NASA is lying about the shape of the Earth or is attempting to deceive the public in some way. This of course falls flat when you visit NASA's own website, which openly discusses how they get these images. It also fails to acknowledge the existence of unedited images showing the whole Earth at slightly lower resolution. There are images like this from multiple organizations such as NASA and the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, which took this non-composite image of the Earth in 2004. Denying a single or even group of edited images by NASA doesn't dismiss the raw images captured by them or other agencies, or allow someone to directly assert NASA as being untrustworthy, especially when they openly acknowledge editing images for clarity. If someone does claim this extends to the non-composite images that exist and just disregards them all as fake, there isn't much a person can do to respond to that. However, there are many other ways to verify the Earth isn't flat, so even if these images are fake, it doesn't gain the flat Earth argument much ground. Though just to clarify, there is no good reason to assert that the images are fake. Further, it is also worth noting that you can verify live images that are taken from the International Space Station if you are near enough to the place it was taken. For example, you could look at the NASA live stream as it flies over where you live and look at the clouds and see if the cloud formation will match up with the live stream, which is something a constant Photoshop marathon would not be able to pull off. However, even if we ignore these criticisms and run with the conspiracy angle, there remains the issue of individuals and separate agencies capturing footage of the Earth from space. To coordinate this conspiracy all over the globe between multiple countries and organizations is incredibly unrealistic, while admittedly not impossible. To disregard these images as evidence places the burden of proof on the people claiming conspiracy, and currently there is no verifiable evidence to corroborate the claims of conspiracy.
Number 3. Things moving away don't disappear because of the horizon, but rather because of limitations of vision. Now, we already addressed this briefly in the first section, but decided it deserved a section of its own. On a flat Earth, we should expect to lose sight of a ship sailing away from the shore only if the ship has travelled far enough away that it appeared too small to perceive visually, or if the atmosphere between the observer and the ship was dense enough to inhibit vision. In both of these scenarios, we can test to see if this is true with very simple experimentation and critical thinking. In the scenario without atmospheric factors reducing our vision, we should see a uniform decrease in the size of the ship until it disappears into a single fine point. We can of course demonstrate that this doesn't happen simply by watching a ship sail away from the shore and observe how the bottom of the ship disappears from view before the top. This is true again for the sun setting, and we can test this further by observing the ship or a setting sun at ground level and then elevating ourselves to a higher perspective and observing how more of the object becomes visible as you gain an elevated perspective over the horizon. If the sun was truly flat, we should see more of the ship become visible by increasing the visual zoom with either a camera or telescope, but rather what we see instead when we do this is simply a zooming in of what is already still visible. We can see this in the video playing. If you want to watch the whole video, you can see the link in the description. In the case of atmospheric interference, objects may disappear earlier than they would normally, and sometimes before they reach the horizon. This can give the appearance of an object simply fading out of view, or in this example shown in the video, we can see how the setting sun seems to disappear as if it were traveling into the distance rather than descending below the horizon. But this video demonstrates clearly why atmospheric obstruction is the cause of the shrinking appearance rather than the sun moving moving into the distance. If the sun was just getting further away, the decrease in visual diameter would continue to decrease at a constant rate. However, we see that the sun only begins to disappear as it approaches the horizon, where the greatest amount of atmosphere is present between the observer and the sun. The decrease in visual diameter also accelerates as the sun gets lower in the sky, which would imply the sun is accelerating rapidly during this period, which of course couldn't be possible, and would at least be very noticeable to other observers. All of this is easy enough to explain when we can simply observe the sun sinking below the horizon on a clear day. Comparing cloudy or dusty atmospheric conditions to clear environments demonstrates this fact clearly. Atmospheric phenomena can also create other visual effects which may affect perspective of objects at and beyond the horizon line. Atmospheric refraction occurs when light passes through air of higher density, causing the light to decelerate by a minuscule fraction. This causes the light to take a slightly curved path due to the decrease in velocity within the denser medium. We can observe this effect easily using water. When a pencil is placed inside a glass of water so that half of the pencil is above the water line, it will appear to distort at the waterline. This is because the light traveling through the water moves slower and exits the water at a different angle to the light which leaves the pencil through the air. See links in the description for a more detailed explanation of this. This phenomena accounts for many of the arguments made in defense of a flat Earth, where people claim to observe objects beyond the expected horizon line. It's important to remember that a single observation, or even a group of observations of objects appearing as visible beyond the horizon in a way we would typically not expect, doesn't dispel the many other observations of objects disappearing behind the horizon. To make this assertion in favor of a flat Earth, there also needs to be a mechanism which can be demonstrated to explain the other observations which go against the assertion, like we have presented here, which demonstrates both an objective way for testing the existence of the horizon, as well as a clear and testable mechanism explaining counter-observations.
Number 4. Water doesn't curve in a container. This argument is based on the simple observation that water will always make itself level with the ground when placed in a container. Observing this fact, proponents of the flat Earth will often assert that this is a valid way of determining curvature of the Earth, since the water should curve to fit the shape of the Earth due to gravity. A response to this is simple. In small bodies of water such as a bowl or even a pool, the degree of curvature would be so minuscule that you would not be able to observe it, especially given the fact that water does have an amount of surface mobility. If, however, you expand the bowl large enough so that the ends of the bowl project past the surface of the Earth, the water inside would begin to curve back towards the center of the Earth. Sadly, IKEA does not make bowls that big, but there is a body of water that is big enough for us to observe curvature in, and that is the ocean. As we've referenced multiple times in this video, the existence of the horizon line over the ocean demonstrates the curvature of the Earth. Water does always find its level, and that level is relative to the globe. Hence, horizon lines exist in the ocean. So water will always flow in the direction of gravity unless obstructed, and since gravity is directed towards the center of the Earth, water will always find its way to the lowest point of elevation. If it didn't, we wouldn't measure mountains based on their height above sea level. Some flat earthers have argued that because gravity is stronger as we get closer to the center, water should sit at a relative height to the seabed rather than find a flat plane. This is something that we can test on a small scale. If you pour water into a cup, it will sit level. If you pour water into a cup with an object inside, the water will fill up around the object until it surpasses the top of the object and becomes level. This occurs because, like we mentioned before, water will find the lowest point of elevation unless obstructed. So for this argument to make sense, it would have to assume there is an opposing force obstructing the water from moving downhill to a lower elevation.
Number 5. Gravity is only a theory. This argument usually presents itself in many different forms, so we will do our best to cover most of them here, though be warned, this section is going to be lengthy. So firstly, the term just a theory is a deeply flawed criticism and stems from a misunderstanding of what the word theory means in science. The flat earth proponents assert that a theory is something that is a guess and not a proven fact. But that is only true for the common colloquial use of the word. In science, the word theory means a coherent group of propositions formulated to explain a group of facts or phenomena in the natural world and repeatedly confirmed through experimental observation. As you can see, this is different to the colloquial meaning of the word theory. Now, how does this apply to gravity? Well, gravity is both a theory and law. When various items dropped in a vacuum, they will fall at 9.81 meters per second, and that observation, simply put, is the law of gravity. The theory of gravity pertains to why those objects fall, which is in regards to mass. So gravity being a theory does nothing to discredit gravity. Now, this leads to the second conflict, where flat earthers will commonly claim that gravity is not proven, and hence it cannot be used in arguments against the flat earth. And this does raise an interesting question. How do we prove gravity? And unfortunately, the question is not easily answered, which is probably one of the sources of confusion. Even deniers of gravity do not deny the observations we see in everyday life. They just typically ascribe these observations to a different force, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. The effect of gravity is easy to observe, that things fall at 9.81 meters per second, at least on Earth. And things of different weights will fall at the same speed in a vacuum. Now, the theory of gravity proposes that all things with mass are brought towards one another, including planets, stars, and galaxies. However, how do we know that this effect is due to the Earth's mass and not some other force? There are several ways that gravity has been tested. We will leave a link in the description as there are too many to cover in this video. However, we will discuss a select few. Firstly, we can observe the motion of planets in space. For example, one of the earliest proofs of gravity is the perihelion of the planet Mercury. Mercury revolves around the Sun in an arc, and this arc has a constant rate of change. This change in arc can be explained by the gravitational tugs of other planets, the oblateness of the Sun, and through general relativity. When all of the math is done, we end up with 574.64 arc seconds with a standard deviation of 0.69 arc seconds. Now, the actual observed perihelion is 574.10 arc seconds with a standard deviation of 0.65 arc seconds, which is extremely close and to a high degree of accuracy. Now, further, we can also observe the motion of other planetary bodies such as Jupiter and its moons. Halley's Comet is also a fantastic example of how this math can be used to make real-world predictions. Edmund Halley used Newton's law to calculate the gravitational effects of Jupiter and Saturn on cometary orbits. These calculations, after examining historical records, allowed him to predict and show his working for that prediction for the return of a comet in 1758. Halley died in 1742, but just as he predicted, the comet became visible in 1758. This was one of the first demonstrations of the power of Newtonian physics and still stands as strong evidence that the theory of gravity is correct. Now, it is common for flat Earth proponents to deny the existence of these planetary bodies, but it is simple enough to get a telescope for yourself and observe them in your own backyard. The existence of the International Space Station also provides strong evidence to the function of gravity. You can watch a live stream of the International Space Station at any time, where you can watch astronauts float around and see the Earth below. Now, for those who would deny the existence of the International Space Station, there are a few reasons why this doesn't hold up. Firstly, you can verify the locations below it in the same way you can for a satellite. Also, you can follow the tracking of the International Space Station that NASA gives you, and you can see it as it flies overhead if you have a good pair of binoculars. Gravitational redshift is the process by which electromagnetic radiation originating from a source in a gravitational field is reduced in frequency when observed in a region at a higher gravitational potential. Basically, the rate at which time passes increases as one moves away from that source. This has been verified using many methods in science, but one essential everyday verification is in the form of a global positioning systems, or GPS. To provide accurate results, the GPS satellites must account for this redshift. Whilst we could go on and continue to list the verifications of the theory of gravity, that would drastically extend the length of the video, so we encourage you to read all of the links we've left in the description. We have to move on to discuss some of the other things flat Earth proponents say about gravity. So, flat Earth proponents will commonly assert that the observations about gravity can be explained using a few alternatives. They sometimes assert that gravity does not pull things downwards, but instead the flat Earth moves upwards at the speed of gravity, which results in what we observe. There are serious issues with this, one being that gravity is not 9.81 meters per second, but instead 9.81 meters per second, which is an accelerating force. So the flat Earth would continue to accelerate upwards at ever increasing speeds and would reach nearly the speed of light in around 1 year. Now, if the Earth wasn't accelerating but simply traveling at 9.81 meters per second, then everyone on it would be too. So if you jumped upwards, you would add extra speed to that, and then you would just fly off into space, as there is no reason for the flat Earth to catch up with you. Also, this would ignore the point that we can observe things that accelerate as they fall. Flat Earth proponents will also claim that it is density, not gravity, that causes the effects that we see. And this is not entirely wrong. Density does influence the effects we see, but density is dependent on gravity. This becomes much clearer when you understand how a helium balloon can float. The helium in the balloon is much less dense than the air in the atmosphere, so gravity pulls the air down underneath the helium balloon. In the same way that bubbles of air will rise as the water around them are pulled down, the denial of gravity only leaves a hole in the explanation of how we are able to make these observations about density, as density itself is not a force which can organize matter in this way, but only a factor which affects the organization of matter with respect to a pulling force, such as gravity. So any assertions made in regards to density require an accompanying explanation of this pulling force, which is consistent with all of the same observations made in regards to gravity. To explain this, flat Earth proponents commonly claim that the Earth is essentially a giant Tesla coil and that electromagnetism can be used to replace gravity. They will assert this based on many reasons, including claiming that Sir Isaac Newton's inverse square law of gravity is essentially identical to Charles Coulomb's inverse square law of electromagnetic attraction. The problem with this is that because they share a certain part of the equation means nothing. It's not the same math. This is similar to saying 2 plus 2 divided by 4 is the same as 100 subtracted by 5 divided by 4, simply because both equations contain dividing by 4. Ignoring this, there are several reasons why electromagnetism is not a valid replacement for gravity. Firstly, gravity has only one observable sign of charge, whereas electromagnetism has two opposing signs of charge. Also, electromagnetism affects different materials differently. If electromagnetism was the force resulting in what we call gravity, then it would affect a block of rubber differently to a block of iron. However, this is not the case with what we observe. A block of rubber and a block of iron will fall at the exact same speed in a vacuum. Further, if electromagnetism was strong enough to result in what we observe and call gravity, it would influence the function of many household objects, such as the monitor you are likely watching this video on right now. We can generate electromagnetism easily in controlled conditions and observe its effects. It is for this reason we can easily make the observation of how it would not robustly explain all of the observations we have explained with gravity. And the model also does not have the ability to make meaningful predictions like the theory of gravity has been able to. Whew, this section has been long. For our final point on gravity, we would like to address one of the most common questions flat Earth proponents have about gravity, which is how come gravity is strong enough to keep all of the oceans on Earth, but not strong enough to stop a bird from flying? Ignoring the fact that if this was really a valid question, then it would apply equally to flat Earth electromagnetism and density models, this question is easy to answer. Birds can fly due to a difference in pressure above and below their wings, thus creating lift. This lift creates upwards momentum that can keep the bird in the air as long as it maintains the effort needed to maintain the pressure. But the old idiom of what goes up must come down is ultimately always true in this case. As soon as the bird stops exerting energy to generate lift, it will ultimately fall to the surface of the Earth. If the ocean was somehow able to create enough lift to cause its entire mass to fly, then it would do so. However, the ocean is very big and doesn't have giant water wings.
Number 6. Polaris can be observed from the Southern Hemisphere. There are a lot of misconceptions about the constellations and position of the stars in regards to the flat Earth. This leaves many flat earthers claiming that stars such as Polaris, also known as the North Star, can be visible from the Southern Hemisphere. Of course, on a globe Earth, we would expect people living on the Southern Hemisphere to see a different night sky than those living in the Northern Hemisphere. This is in fact the case, though many flat earthers will say differently. Flat Earth apologists will point to a star visible in the Southern Hemisphere, which has almost a mirrored position to Polaris. Sigma Octantis is a star that points celestial south. That is, its position in the sky is very close to the position of the South Pole, that it could be used to navigate to the South Pole with a fair degree of accuracy, or it would if it was bright enough. Unlike Polaris, Sigma Octantis is not particularly bright, so instead many refer to the Crux, also known as the Southern Cross, a constellation only visible from south of 25 degrees latitude. This constellation is so prominent and visible within the Southern Hemisphere that it was adapted onto the Australian, Brazilian, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, and Samoan flags. So, while many may point to the star that looks like it could be Polaris in the southern night sky, they are in fact pointing at Sigma Octantis. But if you aren't sure, just look for the Southern Cross. The takeaway point from all of this is that if the Earth was flat, everyone would be able to see Polaris, Sigma Octantis, and the Southern Cross all in the same night.
Number 7. The Sun is 3,000 miles away and rotates about the Earth. This argument is essential for a flat Earth model to be consistent with a night and day cycle. The assertion is that rather than the Earth orbiting the Sun with a 24-hour rotation about its own axis, the Earth is instead stationary, with the Sun orbiting just 3,000 miles above the surface, with the Moon in an opposing position so as to take up the Sun's position after the Sun moves. This obviously clashes with numerous simple observations about the movement of the Sun and Moon. Firstly, if we consider the perspective of observing the Sun moving in such a pattern, there would be no sunset. The Sun would constantly be visible from any position on Earth with a clear view of the sky. This, of course, would mean the existence of time zones or even nighttime darkness could not be possible, as there would always be a degree of sunlight reaching every country, regardless of the Sun's position above the Earth. Even if the Sun's gaze was not sufficient to reach the far end of the flat Earth, the simple use of a telescope from a point of elevation would mean that we could observe the Sun or Moon at any time. Secondly, if the path of the Sun during its east to west cycle was occurring due to the position of the Sun relative to the observer, then the observer would perceive the Sun to increase in diameter as it approached its zenith, and then decrease in diameter as it began to move further away. The path of the Sun would also curve towards and then away from the observer as it made its pass, which would also be true for the Moon, meaning people experiencing night in different locations at the same time would observe different sides of the Moon. If this proposed path for the Sun and Moon were true, then we would also never see either disappear beyond the horizon. For anyone who has enjoyed watching a sunset, this is clearly not the case, but there are further issues still to consider with this argument. The existence of lunar or solar eclipses demonstrates that firstly, the Sun and Moon can't be at the same level on opposing sides of the Earth. If this was the case, there would never be a chance for the Earth to obstruct the Sun's light from reaching the Moon, which we observe during a lunar eclipse. This is the same case for a solar eclipse, because an observer on the Earth would never be able to perceive the Moon in front of the Sun without significant elevation. This argument is one of the simplest to refute, as it only requires simple observation of the Sun and Moon as they move through the sky. However, this is a fundamental argument for the flat Earth, as without a clear description of the Sun and Moon's movement relative to the Earth that fits our empirical observations, all other arguments must overcome this inconsistency.
Number 8. Aircraft pilots don't report having to adjust their angle for the curvature of the Earth. This is a very common argument from flat Earth proponents, where they claim that pilots would have to constantly adjust the angle of the plane to keep level with the curvature of the Earth. And some flat Earth proponents have even gone as far as taking a spirit level onto a plane to assess the angle of the plane as it flies. When addressing this argument, there are a few points that must be made. Firstly, it is important to note how small of a degree of curvature we are dealing with here. It is similar to driving a car around a slight bend. All you need to do is turn the steering wheel very slightly so the car maintains a constant distance from the side of the road. By making an initial adjustment and leaving it there, the car will simply drive around the slight curve without the need for further adjustments. In the same way, the plane is flying around the very slight curve of the Earth simply by having the controls adjusted to maintain a constant altitude. solving the problem of dealing with the Earth's curvature. A pilot will make multiple adjustments for many things during a flight, all with the objective of maintaining altitude. The extremely slight curve will be much less noticeable than the bumps the plane will get due to wind or changes in air pressure. A common way this argument is made is flat Earth proponents will calculate the total drop needed over a certain curvature and then assume there must be several large adjustments to achieve this drop. However, due to the extremely far distance this drop occurs over, it manifests as the plane just maintaining the same distance from the surface of the Earth at all times, so the plane never drops relative to the surface of the Earth. Another limitation is also how the spirit level works. It is just a tube with some liquid in it and a bubble. Because the liquid will always find its level, the bubble will obviously show any changes in angle. Now, whilst this is true, it is worth noting that the level is relative to the surface of the Earth and not the starting point of the journey. So as the plane rotates around the Earth, the angle of the plane relative to the surface of the Earth is always the same. So the spirit level won't actually show anything and isn't actually the correct piece of equipment to use when conducting an experiment like that. Also, while we are on the topic of planes, flat Earth proponents will typically assert that planes don't fly over the Antarctic. This is simply wrong, as many commercial flights do fly to the Antarctic, but only planes with backup engines can make the flight over it. Because if there were any technical issues with the plane, there wouldn't be anyone around to help. We will leave some links in the description showing some of these flights.
Number 9. The Nile flows north, thus disproving gravity. Finally, an argument that won't take long to address. Flat Earth proponents use this argument in regards to several rivers, but it is usually most commonly made about the Nile. And this is just a misconception about how gravity on a globe works. Up and down are relative terms to the Earth itself. So as much as the flow of river must travel around the curvature of the Earth, when relative to the center of the Earth, it is still flat. Also, north is not upwards and south is not downwards. It is perfectly acceptable for a river to flow north, or in any direction for that matter, as long as it is flowing flat or downhill relative to the center of the Earth. We briefly touched on this in the last section when addressing how a spirit level works relative to the curvature of the Earth.
Number 10. NASA faked the moon landing so they could claim the Earth is round. So this is an interesting one, and we risk opening a whole new can of worms here if we aren't careful. If you want to see the moon landing conspiracy addressed, you will have to look somewhere else. We are only interested in how this conspiracy may be used to make assertions about a flat Earth. This is a very similar argument to the one we addressed earlier in the video in regards to the claim that NASA faked or edited images of the Earth. However, in this case, the assertion is that NASA has a specific agenda to convince the public the Earth is round. In order to debunk this argument, we don't need to prove the moon landing is real, only that NASA faking the moon landing doesn't add any credibility to the flat Earth argument. So, even if we accept that the moon landing was faked, we still have to consider the impact this would have on a flat Earth assertion. Firstly, it's important to note that NASA is far from the only organization to work in space. It's reported that, as of 2015, there are approximately 70 countries with space programs. Of those, around 6 have the ability to launch and retrieve satellites, as well as extraterrestrial probes. Probes capable of deep space exploration and photography of the Earth from orbit, for example. These organizations include the Indian Space Research Organization, the European Space Agency, the China National Space Administration, the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and the Russian Federal Space Administration. All of these agencies have the capability to place probes into space and expose the shape of the Earth as either flat or round. Not a single one of them is questioning the fact that NASA placed a human on the moon or that the Earth is actually round. Why not? Are they in a joint conspiracy? Japan conspiring with America to trick the world into thinking the Earth is flat? The Japanese government would have been very quick to forget the results of World War II. How about Russia and America? They were immediate rivals in the race to get to the moon. Would it not be in Russia's interest to expose NASA as a fake? This also doesn't consider all the non-space organizations that rely on a globe Earth model to function. Many companies that rely on astronomy, geoscience, international transport, and engineering all work with a globe Earth model and do so with millions of dollars at risk. There is, of course, an obvious point to remember. Humans have been working with a globe model of the Earth well before the inception of NASA. Since we were able to explore the surface of the planet in its entirety, people began abandoning the idea of a flat Earth. NASA is not the arbiter of the globe Earth. I think you get the picture. There is not a single government on the planet with the ability to go beyond Earth's atmosphere that supports the flat Earth model. All this considered, the argument still has other issues to resolve. If the moon landing is indeed fake, and NASA is in cahoots with every other space-savvy government, there remains the problem of demonstrating evidence in favour of the flat Earth. Taking away from the credibility of evidence that disproves your position doesn't in turn add evidence in favour of your argument. There remains a need to support your assertions with testable and verifiable evidence in either case. And that brings us to the end of our video. Thanks for making it through our top 10 Flat Earth Arguments Debunked video. It is also worth noting that there will be many more arguments made by Flat Earth proponents that aren't addressed in this video, and that's okay. This video is intended to demonstrate the strong evidence for the Earth being a globe and demonstrate that the primary Flat Earth arguments can be easily dismantled. Any other arguments just need to be critically examined as they come up. There will always be new ones cropping up and some that we missed, but the process by which you can address them will remain the same. This video took a ton of work, so it would mean a lot to us if you could hit that thumbs up button and share this around any way you can think to do so. Make sure to check out our references and let us know what you thought about the video in the comments below. Thanks again for watching and helping us raise the bar of public discourse.